The morning Frances Hart found a stranger mending her broken fence line. She almost reached for the shotgun her late husband had left propped beside the kitchen door, and she was deeply grateful she did not. It was the spring of 1882, and the Texas Panhandle was not a place that forgave carelessness. The land stretched out in every direction like a bolt of brown cloth God had unrolled and forgotten to hem, and the wind came down from the north with a kind of personal cruelty that made a person feel singled out. Frances had been alone on the Hart property for 7 months, since the fever took Thomas in October, and those 7 months had taught her things about herself she had not expected to learn. She had learned she could slaughter a hog and salt the meat herself. She had learned she could patch a roof with one good arm holding tar and the other gripping a ladder rung hard enough to whiten her knuckles. She had learned that loneliness had a physical weight to it, something that settled in the chest around 2 in the morning and pressed until you wondered if you would wake up by morning. What she had not yet learned was how to fix the long section of cedar post fencing that ran along the eastern edge of her 40 acres, where the winter ground heave had knocked 3 consecutive posts sideways, and the wire had gone slack enough to let her 2 remaining steers wander. She had propped the wire with a tree branch as a temporary measure, and that branch had been there for 3 months. Now there was a man out there doing what she had not managed to do, and he was doing it without asking. Frances stood on the porch with her morning coffee going cold in her hands and watched him. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a duster the color of dried creek mud, and a battered hat with a crease down the center of the crown. He worked with the particular economy of motion that comes from a lifetime of physical labor, pulling the wire taut with one hand, setting the staple with the other, moving to the next post with no wasted steps. She could not see his face from this distance, only the line of his jaw when he turned to drag another post from the pile he had apparently brought with him, because those posts had not been there yesterday. She set her coffee on the porch rail and walked out to him. The grass was still damp from overnight dew, and it soaked through her boot leather before she had gone 10 steps. She did not hurry. She wanted a moment to look at him honestly before he noticed her, because she had learned that people were most truthful when they did not know they were being observed. He was perhaps 30, maybe a year or 2 on either side of that. His face, when he finally heard her footsteps and turned, was the kind of face the sun had worked on for a long time, weathered without being hardened, with dark eyes that went still when they found her, the way a man's eyes go still when he is caught doing something he did not plan to explain. There was a scar above his left eyebrow, thin and pale, and his jaw was carrying 3 or 4 days of dark stubble. "Morning," he said, and pulled his hat off in a single automatic motion that told her he had been raised with some manners despite everything else about him. "Morning," she said, and let the silence sit there for a moment while she looked at the work he had done. 2 posts were already set, tamped solid, the wire strung tight and stapled. "You are on my land." "Yes, ma'am." He turned the hat in his hands. "I am Andrew Garrett. I have been working for Ben Holloway over at the Rocking H about 4 miles east. I ride past this fence most mornings. And you decided to fix it." He looked at the fence, then back at her. It needed fixing. That was not much of an answer, but it had a simplicity she found she could not argue with. "I am Frances Hart," she said. "This is my land. I appreciate the work, but I would have liked to have been asked first." Something shifted in his expression, a kind of acknowledgement without quite being an apology. "That is fair," he said. "I should have knocked. I will in future." She noticed he said in future rather than in the future, as if he had already decided there would be other occasions. She decided not to point that out yet. "Do you want coffee?" she asked instead. He looked briefly surprised by the question, as if he had been braced for something else. "If it is not too much trouble." It was not too much trouble. She was already walking back toward the house. He finished the fence before he came in. She heard the rhythm of his hammer going for another 20 minutes while she poured fresh coffee and cut 2 slices from the corn bread she had made the evening before. By the time he knocked at the door, having gone around to the pump first to wash his hands. She had composed herself into something approaching ordinary hospitality. He sat at her kitchen table with the unfussy comfort of a man accustomed to working kitchens and took the coffee the way she offered it, black, without asking for anything different. He ate the corn bread and said it was good, and she believed him because he said it in the distracted way that meant he was thinking about something else. "How long have you been at the Rocking H?" she asked. "About 2 years," he said. "Before that, Amarillo. Before that, Abilene. I have been moving around a good while." "Where are you from originally?" "Kentucky, a long time ago." She did not press that. A man who had moved from Kentucky to Abilene to Amarillo to the Texas Panhandle had been moving away from something, and it was too early to ask what. "Thomas, my husband, he was from Kentucky too," she said, and then felt the familiar tightening in her throat that still ambushed her sometimes. "He passed last fall." Andrew Garrett's dark eyes came to her face with a directness that was not intrusive, just present. "I am sorry," he said, and it did not sound like something he had said because it was required. "Thank you," she said. "It was the fever, fast at least." He nodded and looked down at his coffee, and they sat with that for a moment, which Frances found she was grateful for. Most people, when they heard about Thomas, either changed the subject too quickly or pressed her for details in that hungry way of people who have not yet lost anyone and are trying to understand what it feels like. Andrew Garrett did neither. He simply sat with the fact of it. "You have steers," he said eventually. "2. I had 6 last spring. I sold 3 to keep the property taxes paid, and I lost 1 to a cougar in January." 2 is manageable," he said, and the way he said it was not dismissive. It was something closer to a fellow calculation. "It is manageable if the fence holds," she said, and looked at him steadily. He met her eyes, and she thought she saw something in his face that was more than simple neighborly consideration, though she could not have named it yet. "The fence will hold," he said. He left an hour later, mounting a big roan horse with an ease that came from decades in the saddle, and tipped his hat to her from the gate. She watched him ride east until the distance swallowed him, then went inside to the 10,000 small tasks that made up the architecture of a day lived alone on a property that had been built for 2. 3 days later, she found the gate latch on the north paddock replaced. The old one had been rusted through, and she had been tying it closed with a leather strip since February. The new latch was solid iron, well fitted, and there was no sign of who had put it there, except that there was only one person who had expressed any interest in the state of her property. This time she did not have coffee ready because she had not known he was coming. She rode east on her gray mare, which she could not really afford to keep but could not bring herself to sell, because the mare had been a wedding gift from Thomas's mother, and selling her would have felt like something being cut away. She found Andrew Garrett at the Rocking H mending a saddle on a fence rail outside the barn, and she pulled up and looked down at him from the mare's back with what she intended to be a businesslike expression. "You put a new latch on my north paddock gate," she said. He looked up from the saddle without much surprise, as if he had expected this visit. "The old one was rusted through," he said. "I know it was. I had been managing." "With a leather strip?" "Yes." He set the awl down and gave her his full attention in that way he had, like he was turning all of himself toward a thing when he decided it deserved it. "I had a spare latch in my kit," he said. "It did not cost you anything." "It is not about cost," she said, and heard herself sounding sharper than she meant to. She gentled her voice. "Mr. Garrett, Andrew, I am not a woman who does well with things happening on her property without her knowing. I have been the sole person responsible for this land for 7 months, and I have managed. I would like to be consulted." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that particular stillness that she was beginning to recognize as his version of careful thought. "You are right," he said finally. "I should have asked. I keep seeing things that need doing, and he stopped. "You just what?" she asked, because there had been something unfinished in that sentence. He looked away from her, toward the horizon, and she had the sense he was surprised by his own inability to finish the thought. "I cannot answer that simply," he said. It was such an honest thing to say that it disarmed her entirely. She sat on her mare for a moment with no good response to that honesty, and then she said, "Come for supper on Saturday if you are free, and we can talk about what else you think needs doing and whether I agree." He looked back at her. "I would like that," he said. She rode home feeling a warmth in her chest that she did not examine too carefully. He came on Saturday with a jar of preserved peaches that he said had been given to him by Ben Holloway's wife, and that he had been saving for an occasion. Frances had made a beef stew, real beef, because she had butchered the older of the two steers that week, a difficult decision she had made with the cold practicality the land required. She had also made biscuits, which she was better at than corn bread, and set the table with the good dishes she had not used since Thomas died. She noticed when Andrew arrived that he had shaved. It was such a small thing, but it struck her with a tenderness she was not prepared for, the idea that he had looked in whatever mirror he had available that morning and decided the occasion warranted a razor. They talked through supper and into the evening, and Frances found that he was easier to talk to than she had expected a mostly silent man who went around mending strangers' fences to be. He had opinions on things, quiet but firm. He thought the cattle drives up the western trail were already dying, and that the smart ranchers in the Panhandle were going to have to adapt to the railroad or not survive. He had read which she had not assumed, and they argued pleasantly about whether Walter Scott's novels were worth the time it took to finish them. He thought not. She thought yes. "You are stubborn," he said, not unkindly, when she held her position on Rob Roy for the third time. "I am correct," she said. "There is a difference." He laughed then, a genuine laugh that changed his face entirely, making it younger and less guarded, and Frances felt something shift in her chest like a door opening onto a room she had not known was there. After supper, he helped her clear without being asked, and she let him because it felt natural rather than out of obligation. They stood side by side at the wash basin, the kitchen lamp throwing warm light over everything, and the comfortable silence between them had a different quality now, fuller somehow, the way silence gets when it is shared rather than merely inhabited. "Tell me about Kentucky," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "My father had a farm. He was not a kind man. When I was 17 I left and came west because west was the direction things ended and I wanted to see where they ended." "And where do they end?" she asked. "I have not found it yet," he said. She thought about that. Maybe you do not need to find it. Maybe you just need to find a place where you want to stop looking. He turned from the wash basin and looked at her directly for a long moment, and the lamp light was in his eyes, and she felt her face go warm under that look. "Maybe so," he said softly. He left before 10, which was polite by any measure, and she stood on the porch and watched his lantern bob away into the dark and tried not to think too carefully about the fact that she had enjoyed that evening more than any she had spent in 7 months. The following Tuesday morning she went out to check the kitchen garden and found that someone had fixed the lean-to roof over the tool shed, which had been sagging badly since February and which she had been propping from inside with a length of pine that was rotting at the base. The repair was done cleanly with fresh lumber, and there were new hinges on the shed door as well. She stood there with her hands on her hips and a feeling that was somewhere between exasperation and something far warmer, and she thought about riding to the rocking H again and then thought better of it. Instead, she wrote a note and gave it to the boy who carried mail along the farm road twice a week. The note said, "Andrew, I found the shed roof. I suppose I should stop being surprised. Come for supper again when you are able, Frances." He came the following Sunday, and then the following Saturday after that. And then it became a regular thing, Saturdays or Sundays, sometimes both, and somewhere in there the formality wore off, and she started calling him by his first name without thinking about it, and he started calling her Frances, and those meals stretched longer each time, and they found more and more to talk about. He told her about Abilene in the cattle drive years, the chaos and money and lawlessness of it, and she told him about growing up in Virginia, the eldest of 6 children, the one her father had wanted to be a son because she had been born first. She told him how she had met Thomas at a church social in Fredericksburg when she was 22, and how they had come west together with what Thomas called a reasonable amount of capital, and what had actually been enough to buy the land and a hope and not much else. "You were not afraid?" Andrew asked one evening, leaning back in his chair after supper with his coffee, looking at her across the table with those dark eyes. "Coming out here?" "I was terrified," she said, "but Thomas was so certain. He had that quality certainty. It made you feel like the ground was solid even when it was not. Do you miss that, the certainty?" She thought about it honestly. "Sometimes," she said, "but I have learned to make my own. It is slower work, but it holds better." He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I imagine it does." April became May and May became June, and the Texas heat settled in with the proprietary confidence of a creditor. Frances worked her kitchen garden and her steers and the 100 other tasks of the property, and she found herself noticing things through Andrew's eyes, the way you start to perceive a landscape differently when you know you will be describing it to someone. She noticed the first wild verbena coming up along the fence line he had fixed. She noticed the way the sunset hit the tool shed he had repaired, laying golden light across the new lumber. She noticed other things too, small ones. He remembered that she took her coffee strong. He knew she disliked the smell of tobacco and never smoked near her. When she mentioned something in passing, something she needed or something she was thinking about, he listened with the quality of attention that meant he would remember it later. One evening she mentioned that the well pump handle had developed a squeak that was not mechanical trouble, just irritating, and the next morning the squeak was gone. She stood at the pump in the early light, pressing the handle up and down in the silence, and felt tears rise unexpectedly into her eyes, which she was immediately furious at herself about. She was not sad. She could not explain the tears except that the silence of the pump, that simple, small act of care, had gotten past some guard she had not known she was keeping. She wiped her eyes on her sleeve and went back inside to make breakfast, and told herself firmly that she was a woman of 26 with 2 steers and 40 acres to manage, and she did not have the luxury of being sentimental about pump handles. But she was thinking about him. She was thinking about him in ways that had moved well past neighborly gratitude and into territory she had not expected to be in again, territory she had thought closed to her when Thomas died, because you do not marry the land and the person together and then think of separating them. But here she was, and here Andrew was, and the territory was opening up whether she invited it to or not. The question that she had asked him once, why he kept fixing things around her property, had not been answered to her satisfaction. She had not pushed it. She had a sense that the answer was one he was working out himself, and that pressing it would only make him retreat from it. In late June, trouble arrived in the form of Dale Prout. Dale Prout was a land speculator from Amarillo who had been buying up struggling homesteads across the Panhandle with a patience and thoroughness that put Frances in mind of a man pulling weeds, systematic, thorough, and indifferent to the weeds' perspective on the matter. He rode onto her property on a Wednesday morning in a good coat that said he did not do physical labor, and with a smile that did not reach the cold blue of his eyes. He wanted to buy her land. He put it at a fair price, which was part of what made her wary, because in her experience fair prices from men with cold eyes were never as fair as they appeared. He pointed out pleasantly that 40 acres with 2 steers was a difficult proposition for a woman alone, and that the recent drought conditions in the western counties were moving east and that her well depth might become a concern. He knew about her well. That was the thing that stayed with her after he rode away. He had done his research, which meant he had been watching, and he was here because he believed she was close enough to struggling that she might say yes. She did not say yes. She said she would think about it, which was the polite way of saying no without inviting an argument. That Saturday, Andrew came for supper and she told him about Prout. She watched his face as she talked. He was very still, the way he got when something required careful processing, but there was a tightening around his jaw that she had not seen there before. "He knows about your well depth," Andrew said. "That is what worried me most, yes. That means he has talked to someone local or he had someone look at your property." "I thought that too." She folded her hands on the table. "The land is mine and the taxes are paid. He cannot compel me to sell." "No," Andrew said. "He cannot. But men like Prout do not rely on compulsion when inconvenience serves just as well." He looked at her steadily. "If your water source becomes unreliable, or if your fence goes down and your steers get out onto neighboring land and someone makes a complaint, or if any number of small difficulties mount up, he creates pressure," she said, "and then offers relief." They were quiet for a moment. Frances felt a familiar anger moving through her. The anger she had felt when she was 12, and her father had given her share of the farm work to her younger brother simply because he was male. The anger she had felt when Thomas's estate had required her to produce documentation of her identity, as though she might have invented her own marriage. It was the anger of a woman who kept finding that the world had made decisions about her before she arrived. "I am not selling," she said. "I know," Andrew said. "I built something here. Thomas and I built something here and he is gone, but the building is still mine." "I know that too," Andrew said. She looked at him across the table. The lamp was between them. "I am not asking you to fix this," she said, because she wanted to be clear, because she had learned to be clear. "I know," he said for the third time, and his voice had that quality of complete attention. "I am just going to tell you that I am here, whatever that means to you, whatever that means to you." It was such a careful thing to say, leaving the meaning entirely in her hands, and she felt the warmth in her chest again, deeper this time, insistent. "Thank you," she said quietly. They ate supper, and after they did the dishes he stayed later than usual, and they sat on the porch in the cooling dark because June evenings in the Panhandle were bearable after 9 o'clock, and they talked about smaller things, the way the night birds sounded, a story he had heard in town about someone's mule that had wandered into the general store. Small things, safe things. But the warmth in her chest did not diminish, and she thought, from the way he kept looking at the stars rather than going home, that he felt something similar. July brought the drought Prout had mentioned. Not a catastrophic drought, but a real one, weeks without rain, the creek that marked her southern boundary dropping to a narrow trickle, the kitchen garden requiring daily hauling from the well to keep from burning up. Frances rose before dawn every morning and worked until the heat became unreasonable, and then rested and worked again in the late afternoon. And she was tired in a bone-deep way that felt different from grief, more physical, almost clarifying. Andrew rode over more frequently. He always came with a reason, a question about something he had observed on the fence line, a tool he had borrowed and was returning, a small surplus from the Rocking H's kitchen garden that Ben Holloway's wife had sent. Frances accepted all of these with a straight face and a grateful heart, understanding that the reasons were not quite the point. One afternoon in mid-July she was hauling water from the well to the kitchen garden, bucket by bucket in the killing heat, her hair coming loose from its pins and her dress soaked through at the back, and she heard a horse and turned to see Andrew riding in, dismounting before the horse was fully stopped in the way he had, already reaching for the second bucket before he had said hello. "You do not have to do that," she said. "Two people haul faster than one," he said, and took the bucket. They worked side by side through the late afternoon, not talking much, just working, and there was something in the shared labor that was more intimate than conversation. The way their timing fell into rhythm without planning it, the way he moved around her naturally, knowing where she would be without looking, and she the same with him. By the time the garden was watered and the sun had dropped to a lower angle and the heat had released a few degrees, she was aware of him with every part of her that was not occupied with practical thought. They washed at the pump together and she handed him a towel she had brought out and he dried his hands and face, and she realized she was looking at him in a way that was not particularly disguised. He looked back. He looked back with the same openness. "Frances," he said. "Andrew," she said. And then neither of them said anything for a moment, standing in the long afternoon light by the pump with the wet towel between them, and she thought later that it was the longest moment she had ever lived through, and also somehow the most comfortable. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it plainly because I think you deserve plainness." "I appreciate plainness," she said. "I have been coming over here more than is strictly necessary for fence repair," he said. "I had noticed," she said, "and I find that he stopped, looked at the towel in his hands, looked back at her. "I am not a man who is easy with words for things that matter," he said. "I can tell you the angle at which a post needs to be set or the gauge of wire that holds best in this soil. But the other kind of thing," he made a small frustrated gesture with one hand. "Try," she said gently. He looked at her directly, and the brown eyes were very open, no guard at all. "I think about you," he said, "more than is reasonable for a man who has been hired to work 4 miles away. I think about whether your fence is holding, and whether your well is giving water, and whether you are sleeping enough. And I know those are just other ways of saying I think about you." Frances felt the warmth in her chest spread through her entirely. She was quiet for a moment because she wanted to be as honest as he was, and honesty required care. "I think about you too," she said. "I notice when it has been more than a few days and you have not come over, and that is not how I think about fence repair." He let out a breath. It was not quite a laugh, but it had relief in it. "I was not sure," he said. "I did not want to assume. You are not a woman who wants things assumed." "No," she said, "I am not. But I am also not a woman who wants things to go unsaid indefinitely because both people are being careful. So we have said it," he said. "We have said it," she agreed. He was looking at her with that full attention look that she had come to know as the most Andrew Garrett thing about him, and she thought he might say something else, or step closer, or any number of things, but what he did was hold the towel out to her and say, "You should probably eat something. You have been working for 4 hours." It was so characteristic of him that she laughed, a real laugh, and took the towel. "I made a cold potato soup this morning," she said. "Come inside." "I was hoping you would say that," he said. The shift in things after that evening was gradual but unmistakable, like a season changing, not on a particular day but in the accumulated weight of days. He still came with reasons, but the reasons were no longer quite so determinedly practical, and he did not bother maintaining the fiction that they were. He came with reasons the way a person brings a small gift, not because the gift is necessary, but because it is nice to have something to hold out. He came on a Thursday morning in early August and helped her mend the roof edge of the house where the tar had cracked over the winter. The two of them up on the roof in the morning cool before the heat took over, working from opposite ends toward the middle. When they met in the center, she was crouched over a particularly bad section, and he was kneeling beside her showing her the technique for pressing the new tar into the crack, and his hand was over hers on the tool, and she became aware of his nearness with an intensity that had nothing to do with roofing. She turned her head and found his face very close, and his dark eyes were right there, and the question that had been between them since that afternoon by the pump was more urgent now. "Andrew," she said quietly. "Yes," he said, and it was not an answer to anything she had asked, but it was an answer. He kissed her, up on the roof of her house with the morning light coming in hard and golden from the east, and the tar smell around them, and the Texas Panhandle going on in every direction below. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kind of kiss a person who has been holding something back gives when they finally decide to stop holding it. It was warm and careful and so completely him that she felt she had known it was coming for months and was only surprised by how right it felt. She pulled back after a moment and looked at him with the same directness she brought to everything. "I want to be clear about what this means," she said. "So do I," he said. "I'm not looking for something temporary. I have 40 acres and 2 steers, and I am 26 years old, and I want a life that is built, not visited. If you are still heading somewhere west, I am not," he said. And then, with a quiet certainty that was different from Thomas's expansive certainty, more contained but somehow solider for it. I have not been looking to leave since I found this fence line. She held that for a moment. Then she nodded once and turned back to the roof tar, and he turned back to it too, and they finished the job in the warm, companionable silence of two people who have settled something. In September, Dale Prout came back. He came with a different manner this time, less pleasant, more direct, and he brought with him a young man who was clearly meant to lend physical weight to the visit, though Frances noted the young man seemed uncomfortable with that role. Prout had heard, he said, that her second steer had gone lame, which was true, and he offered his previous price with an additional comment that the offer was time-sensitive. Frances stood on her porch with her arms crossed and her face composed. She did not invite them in. "My offer stands at no," she said. "It has always stood at no. I would appreciate you remembering that." Prout smiled the cold smile. "Mrs. Hart, a woman in your position." "My position," Frances said, "is the legal owner of 40 acres in Hartley County, current on all taxes, with every right to stay exactly where I am for as long as I please. If you have any legal business with this property, you may contact me in writing through the county office. Otherwise, I have work to do." She held the door and waited until they mounted and rode, and then she went inside and stood at the kitchen table and let her hands shake for a moment before she got herself together. 2 days later she rode to town, to Canyon, which was close enough to be practical and large enough to have a land attorney. She spent an hour with him and paid him with money from the reserve she kept in Thomas's old tobacco tin, and she came home with a clearer understanding of her legal position and the confidence that her position was sound. She told Andrew about it that Sunday when he came for supper, and she told him about going to the attorney herself, because she wanted him to know she had done it on her own authority, not waited for him to handle it. He listened and then said, "Good. That is exactly right. You are not going to say anything about how I should have told you Prout was coming back." "No," he said. "You handled it. It was yours to handle." She looked at him across the table. "You are a very particular kind of man," she said. "Is that good or bad?" "It is very good," she said. He came to her side of the table and took her hand and looked at her in that full-attention way, and she felt his thumb move across her knuckles and thought that she had perhaps never been looked at with this quality of seeing before in her life. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "I want to ask if you would be willing to let me stay closer," he said. "Not in the house, if that is not right, but closer. There is a bunkhouse arrangement at the Rocking H that would do for a while, but the Rocking H is 4 miles away," and he stopped. "And," she said. "And 4 miles feels like a long way," he said simply. She understood what he was saying and not saying. He was asking to be nearby because it mattered to him to be nearby. He was not asking to rush anything or to make assumptions. He was asking for proximity in the way you ask for something you cannot quite do without. "There is a Linecamp shack on the south side of the property," she said. "Thomas built it when we first came. It is not much, but it is solid. It has a stove." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her. "Frances, Andrew, I am trying to tell you that he stopped again, and she saw the same thing she had seen that first day by the fence post, that genuine frustrated honesty of a man who was better with his hands than with words for the things that mattered. "I know," she said quietly. "I know. I want to be here," he said. "I want to be here more than I have wanted to be anywhere in a very long time." She squeezed his hand. "Then be here," she said. He moved his things to the Linecamp shack at the end of September, giving his notice at the Rocking H in the way of a man who has made a decision and is not uncertain about it. Ben Holloway was regretful but understanding, and his wife sent Frances a jar of apple butter and a note that said she thought Frances Hart was a sensible woman, which Frances suspected was high praise from that quarter. The shack was small and plain, and Andrew made it his own with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. He was there in the mornings when she came out to start her day and in the evenings when the work was done, and the days had a shape now that they had not had since Thomas, not the same shape, nothing like the same shape, but a shape, a structure, something to lean against. They spent October working the property together. He helped her put the kitchen garden to bed for winter, pulling stakes and covering the root vegetables she would leave in the ground, and she helped him restring the rest of the eastern fence line that was starting to go loose, and they argued cheerfully about the best method for a new gate she wanted on the north side. And she was right about the gate, and he admitted it with such good grace that she forgave him immediately. They fell into something that was domestic in the best sense of the word, the comfortable practical intimacy of two people who keep the same rhythms and know each other's habits. She knew he took his first cup of coffee outside whatever the weather, standing in the pre-dawn looking at the sky in some personal weather assessment. He knew she needed 20 minutes of quiet in the mornings before she was ready to talk to anyone, including him, and he gave those 20 minutes without comment. He knew she kept Thomas's Bible on the night table not from particular religious conviction, but because it had been his, and she was not ready to put it away. She knew he had a bad shoulder from a horse fall in his Abilene years that ached in cold weather, and she started keeping a liniment on the kitchen shelf that she had learned from Ben Holloway's wife. They spent October evenings reading or talking or both, sometimes she reading aloud to him from the books she had, which were not many but were well chosen, and he listening with genuine attention and the occasional pointed comment that showed he was tracking everything. She kissed him good night at the door each evening, and he went to the line camp shack, and those kisses were careful and warm and full of restraint on both their parts, the restraint of people who understand the weight of things and do not want to handle them carelessly. In November the first norther blew through, a genuine panhandle norther that dropped the temperature 30 degrees in an afternoon and came with a wind that had nothing apologetic about it. Frances was in the barn when it hit, and she stayed there until the first violence of it passed, huddled with her gray mare and listening to the structure around her groan and hold. When she ran from the barn to the house, Andrew was already on the porch waiting, having come from the shack the moment the sky changed, and he held the door open for her with the matter-of-fact calm of a man who has weathered many things and intends to weather this too. They sat the storm out in the kitchen with the stove roaring and a pot of soup on it, and the wind threw itself against the house all night, and she found herself grateful, not just for the warmth of the house, but for the warmth of him across the table from her, steady and present in the lamplight. The storm lasted 2 days. On the second evening, when it was clear the worst was done and the wind was dropping to something merely unpleasant, they were sitting by the stove, and he was looking at her with that expression she had come to know as his deepest seriousness, the particular stillness that meant he had been working toward something for a while. "I love you," he said. He said it the way he fixed fence posts, plainly, solidly, without ornamentation, as though it were a thing that needed to be true before anything else could stand straight. Frances looked at him for a long moment. The stove ticked and the wind pressed against the glass, and outside the panhandle was doing its worst, and inside was this lamplight warmth, Andrew Garrett's dark eyes looking at her with everything he was in them. "I love you too," she said. And then, because she was Frances Hart and she did not do things by halves, "I have for a while. I was trying to be certain before I said it." "Are you certain?" he asked. "Andrew," she said, "I am certain of very few things in this life. I am certain the ground is cold in January, and certain that water runs downhill, and certain that I love you. Those 3 things I will stake everything on." He moved from his chair and came and knelt in front of hers, which was not something she had expected from this man who expressed himself in action rather than gesture, and he took both her hands in his and looked up at her. "I am not a man with much to offer in the material sense," he said. "I have my horse and my tools and the contents of a line camp shack, and I am good with fences and capable of learning whatever else needs learning. I know this land is yours and what you have built on it is yours, and I am not coming here to take the wheel from you." "I know that," she said. "I am asking if I can stay," he said, "properly, if you would have me, as your husband, if that is what you want." The word husband sat in the room between them, serious and large. She looked at him holding her hands in the lamplight and thought about Thomas, because you could not think about Thomas at a moment like this. Thought about the different kind of man he had been, the sweeping certainty versus this quiet constancy, and understood that she was not replacing anything and that Thomas would not have wanted her to turn away from this kind of love because it was a different kind. "Yes," she said. "I want that. I would have you." He stood and gathered her hands up with him, and she stood too, and he held her with the warmth and solidity she had been learning to trust. And the storm blew outside and the stove ticked inside, and she felt the ground beneath her life shift and settle into something new and firmly held. They were married in early January 1883 by Judge Thomas Whitfield in Canyon, a civil ceremony with Ben Holloway and his wife as witnesses. Frances wore her best dress, the dark blue wool, and Andrew wore a coat she had not seen before, a good one, which made her wonder with some tenderness how far he had ridden to find it. He put a gold ring on her finger that he had purchased in Amarillo the week before, plain and heavy, and she put one on his, a ring she had commissioned from the Canyon blacksmith from a piece of copper that had been Thomas's belt buckle, because she wanted the ring to be made of something from this land, this life, and because she thought Thomas would have appreciated the logic of it. They came home to the Hart property in the late afternoon, and the winter light was making the whole landscape golden and unlikely, and Andrew drove the wagon and she sat beside him with her hand through his arm, and they came up the road to the house with the patched roof and the solid fence and the repaired tool shed, and it was the most complete thing she had ever felt. She changed the property's registered name the following spring, when they went to the county office for other paperwork, to the Garrett Hart property. Not because Andrew asked her to, but because she wanted her name first and his name there, because it was both of theirs now and language should reflect that. The spring of 1883 was good. The drought broke in April, real rain, soaking rain that came down for 3 days and turned the creek back to a proper creek and made the kitchen garden look like something worth hoping for. Andrew and Frances put in a larger garden that year, and 3 new steers, which he had bought from a rancher outside Amarillo who was reducing his herd. He had an eye for cattle that she respected, and she had an eye for the condition of the land that he respected, and together they were better than either alone. They argued sometimes, as people do who both have opinions and are not afraid of them. About money management, and about the best winter feed for the steers, and once about whether to take in a drifting ranch hand who had appeared at the gate hungry and injured. Frances wanted to help him and Andrew was cautious, and they each said their piece plainly and then helped the man and watched him carefully, and he turned out to be entirely harmless, a boy named Seth from Oklahoma who had been thrown from a horse. He stayed 3 days and left with a meal pack and Frances's opinion justified. "You were right," Andrew said that evening. "I usually am," she said. He gave her the look that had no words for it, the look that was only his and only for her, and she felt it like warmth. Dale Prout made one more appearance in July of 1883. He rode onto the property and found Andrew mending the gate on the north paddock, the same paddock Andrew had originally fixed the latch on, and Andrew stood up from his work and looked at Prout with a quietness that was not threatening but was entirely immovable. "Mrs. Hart," Prout began. "Mrs. Garrett," Andrew said, not loudly. "Her name is Frances Garrett." Prout looked at him for a moment, reassessing his position with the calculation of a man who has found the board different from what he expected. "I am looking to speak with the property owner about a business matter." "The property is registered to Frances Garrett and Andrew Garrett jointly," Andrew said. "I can take a message to my wife, or you can state your business to me, or you can ride on. Those are your options." Prout looked at the fence, at the house beyond it, at Andrew standing in front of all of it. Something about what he saw must have settled whatever calculation he was making, because he tipped his hat in a motion that was barely polite and turned his horse and rode back the way he came. He did not return after that. Frances, who had watched from the porch, came down to stand beside Andrew, and he turned to her with a look that was simply checking whether she was all right. "Thank you," she said, "but I could have managed him." "I know you could," he said. "I just got there first." She put her hand in his. "I know," she said, "and I did not mind this time." He smiled. It was a thing that still did the same thing to her that it had done the first time she saw it, made him younger, unmade the weathering, let her see the man under all the years of keeping everything managed. By the fall of 1883, Frances knew she was expecting, and the knowledge settled in her not with fear but with a deep, layered joy that she had not anticipated. She had not been sure, after a few years of marriage to Thomas with no children, whether this would be possible for her. She held the knowledge privately for 2 weeks, not from any desire to hide it from Andrew, but because she wanted to be certain of it herself first, to have sat with it and known it before she brought it to him. She told him on a Sunday evening after supper, out on the porch in the October cool, and she watched his face as she told him, watched the information move through him the way important things move through a person, first the understanding, then the feeling, and then something very quiet and very deep. He put his arms around her, carefully, as though she were suddenly fragile, which she immediately corrected by standing straight and giving him a clear-eyed look. "I am not made of glass," she said. "I am made of the same materials I was made of yesterday." "Yes," he said, still holding her, "you are. But this is," she looked at his face, the open, honest face that she had grown to love as she loved the view from her own front porch, familiar and never quite the same twice. "This is the best thing," she said. "Yes," he said against her hair, "it is." Their son was born in the early spring of 1884, on a night when the last cold of winter was retreating and the first warmth of spring was feeling its way in. And Frances's labor was hard and long, and she did it with the same stubborn competence she brought to every difficult thing. The woman who came to help, Dora Whitfield, the judge's wife who had delivered half the babies in that part of the county, told Andrew afterward that Frances was the most determined patient she had ever attended. "Did she complain?" Andrew asked. "Not once," Dora said, with the expression of a woman who had seen a great deal. "She gave orders, which is different." They named him Thomas James Garrett. Thomas for the man who had loved this land first, James for Andrew's grandfather, the only member of his Kentucky family he had spoken of with any warmth. It was a name that carried both backward and forward, which felt right for a boy born in the middle of a life that was doing the same thing. Andrew held his son with the particular terror and wonder of a man who is holding something entirely new and entirely essential. And Frances watched from the bed and felt a completeness that she had not known she was missing, though she understood, looking at it, that she had been working toward it for some time. The years settled in around them. Thomas grew into a boy who had his mother's directness and his father's steadiness, a combination that produced a child of formidable reliability, and the kitchen garden grew larger each year, and the steers became a small proper herd as the years accumulated, and the operation became more of what it had always had the potential to be. The Garrett Hart property, as everyone still called it, because names stick regardless of official records, became known in the county as a solid operation, well run, the fences always good, the cattle in decent condition. People came to Andrew with questions about fence work and cattle husbandry, and he answered them plainly and without making much of his own expertise. People came to Frances with questions about the law of land ownership, particularly the women, particularly the ones whose situations were difficult, and she answered those questions just as plainly, and sometimes rode with them to Canyon to see the land attorney whose card she had kept. In the fall of 1885, Seth, the young drifter from Oklahoma who had stayed 3 days and left with a meal packed 2 years earlier, came back. He came on a decent horse and with a decent hat and a manner that had been worn into shape by a couple more years of living. He asked Andrew if there was work. Andrew asked Frances. Frances said yes, if he proved out, and he proved out in the first week and stayed on for 2 years, learning the operation with the eagerness of a person who has been waiting to put down roots. And he and Andrew developed a friendship that had the particular quality of men who express things through working alongside each other. In 1886, Frances found herself expecting again. This time she told Andrew the same evening she was certain. He put his hand on her face very gently and looked at her with the full attention look. "How are you?" he asked, meaning something broader than the medical question. "I am wonderful," she said, and meant it. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1887, on a day when the verbena was coming up along the fence line, and the whole east field was looking like something a person could believe in. They named her Clara, which had been Frances's mother's name, and the girl came into the world with dark eyes exactly like Andrew's and an expression that was, Frances said immediately, of complete critical assessment. "She is looking at us like we are a property she has not decided to purchase," Andrew said. "She is sensible," Frances said, "like her mother." Clara was followed by an early childhood of robust, occasionally alarming health, and an absolute certainty about her own opinions that had every adult in her vicinity in a perpetual state of negotiation. Thomas, 4 years older, took his role as elder brother with the seriousness it deserved, and the two of them were constantly in each other's company and frequently in each other's way, and the house that had been built for two had grown into itself and was the right size now for four. Andrew and Frances stood on the porch one evening in the summer of 1887, after the children were in bed, and the stars were enormous overhead, the way Panhandle stars get when the sky decides to make a point, and she was leaning against him and his arms were around her, and the land stretched out before them, the fences holding, the garden growing, the house solid. "Do you remember," she said, "when I came out and found you fixing my fence and came to tell you off for being on my land without asking?" "I remember," he said. His voice was warm above her head. "I was going to be very firm about it," she said. "You were very firm about it." "I was," she agreed. "And then I asked if you wanted coffee." "Best invitation I have ever accepted," he said. She turned in his arms and looked at his face, the face she knew now as well as she knew her own hands, the scar above his eyebrow and the jaw and the dark eyes that were never without expression to anyone who knew how to read them, and she had long since learned. "Why did you fix it?" she asked. The question she had asked all those years ago and never quite gotten the whole answer to. He was quiet for a moment, not the hesitating quiet but the thinking clearly quiet. "I rode past that fence for 2 months," he said, "every morning. And every morning I thought about how it needed fixing and about who was in that house managing without it fixed. And one morning he stopped." "You just," she said. "I could not ride past again," he said. "I could not look at it one more time and not do something about it. I did not have a reason, I just had to." "That is still not a simple answer," she said. "No," he said, "it is not." She looked at him. "I think it is the truest answer, though," she said quietly. He bent and kissed her forehead, then her temple, then very gently her mouth. "I think you are right," he said. "I usually am," she said against his lips, and she felt him smile. They stood on the porch a while longer, in the big Panhandle night, with the stars doing their extravagant work overhead and the land quiet around them, and the sound of their children sleeping in the house behind them. And Frances thought about the morning she had almost reached for the shotgun, and then had walked out instead to look at a man mending her fence in the early light. And she thought about all the mornings since and all the mornings ahead. And she held the thought, with the same care she had learned to bring to everything that mattered. In 1888, Seth married a young woman from Canyon named Adeline, and the wedding was held on the Garrett Hart property, which had a proper arbor now on the south side of the house that Andrew had built with Thomas's assistance the previous spring. Frances made 3 pies and Andrew built the tables from lumber he had been saving, and half the county came because the Garrett Hart property had become the kind of place where things happened that mattered. Thomas, at 7, was deeply solemn about his responsibility to help serve the food, and then ate an amount of pie that suggested his solemnity had been calculated. Clara, at 3, attached herself to Adeline's wedding dress and had to be gently detached 3 separate times, which Adeline bore with the patience of a woman who had already understood what she was marrying into. Andrew danced with Frances in the evening, when someone produced a fiddle and there was dancing on the flat ground beside the arbor, and he was not a natural dancer, but he was steady, and she was, and they managed well together in the lamplight while the fiddle played something from another century, and the stars came out and Seth and Adeline looked at each other the way people look when they are at the beginning of something. "We looked like that," Frances said into Andrew's shoulder. "We did," he said. "We still do," she said. "I think." He pulled back and looked at her with the full attention look. "We still do," he said, with the absolute conviction of a fence post set right. She laughed and put her head back on his shoulder and let the fiddle carry them around the lamplit square of ground. And the night was warm and the land was good, and everything she had built and lost and rebuilt was right there in arm's reach, which was the only place she had ever needed it to be. The years after that settled like good soil around a well-set post, firm and yielding at once, giving things a place to grow. The property expanded in 1889 when the parcel to the north came available, the owner having decided to relocate to New Mexico, and Frances and Andrew together went to the county office and registered the addition. 20 more acres, which meant a longer fence line and more work, but also more kitchen garden space and room for a proper hay meadow, which would reduce their winter feed costs significantly. Thomas, at 9, had appointed himself in charge of knowing everything about the new 20 acres, and he tramped every inch of it within the first week with a proprietary thoroughness that made his father smile in the way of a man seeing himself from the outside. "He is exactly like you," Frances told Andrew one evening, watching Thomas from the window as the boy moved methodically along the new fence line, checking each post with his small hands. "He is exactly like you," Andrew said. "He just happens to express it by fixing things." She laughed because it was true on both counts, and that was what made it funny. Clara, at 5, was more interested in the chickens they had acquired that spring than in the fence line. She had named every one of them, and had opinions about their characters that she reported at mealtimes with the authority of a naturalist. Andrew listened to these reports with the same attention he brought to everything Frances said, and Frances loved him particularly for this, for the way he made their children feel that what they noticed was worth noticing. There were hard things, too, in those years, because there always are. A harsh winter in 1890 that killed 2 of their cattle and put the hay supply at desperate levels, and required Andrew to make 3 trips to Canyon in brutal cold to negotiate for feed. Frances's sister back in Virginia wrote with news that their mother had died in the autumn of that year, and Frances sat in the kitchen with the letter and felt the particular grief of distance, the grief of not having been there, the grief of a life lived so far from where you started that the important things happen without you. Andrew sat with her through that evening, not filling the silence with anything but his presence, which was the right thing. He understood, she thought, that some griefs needed to be held quietly, without solution, just acknowledged. She had written to each of her 5 siblings that year, real letters, long ones, and received replies from 3 of them. The other 2 were simply gone in the way that distance makes some people go, and she had made her peace with it, not without sadness, but with the practical acceptance of a woman who had spent 10 years learning that life was what you built where you stood. In 1892, there was a good year, the kind of year the land only gave you occasionally, as if it was paying off a long-standing debt. The rain came right, the garden was extraordinary, the cattle were healthy, and they sold well at the fall market for a price that let them pay off the remaining note on the north parcel and have enough left over for a new cook stove, which Frances had been wanting for 3 years. They put the new stove in on a Saturday in November, Andrew and Seth together hauling it in from the wagon, and Frances stood back and looked at it in the kitchen with the particular satisfaction of a person who has spent years making do with less and has finally gotten the right tool. "It is a beautiful stove," Andrew said, watching her look at it. "It is a practical stove," she corrected. "It is beautiful because it is right for the work." "That is what I said," he told her. She turned and looked at him, and the years were in his face now, the weathering deeper, the gray coming into the dark hair at his temples, and she thought she had never found a face more interesting to look at. He was 38 and she was 34, and they had been making this life together for 9 years, and the making had left its marks on them both, the good kind of marks, the kind that show what a thing has been used for. "Andrew," she said. "Frances," he said. "Come here," she said. He came and she put her arms around him in the kitchen with the new stove gleaming behind him and the November light coming through the window, and she held him with the confident, unself-conscious warmth of a woman who knows exactly where she is and exactly who she is with. "Thank you," she said into his shoulder. "For the stove?" he asked, but his voice said he knew it was not for the stove. "For all of it," she said. "For coming to fix my fence without asking, for not being able to answer simply why you did it, for the coffee and the supper and the gate latch and the pump handle and the shed roof and everything after." He was holding her with the same warmth she had come to know as his most essential quality, the warmth of complete constancy. "Frances," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "I know." They stood in the kitchen while the November light moved across the floor, and the house breathed around them with the sound of a home that had been lived in and would go on being lived in. And it was so complete, so entirely itself, that she held it in her chest and thought about how this was the thing, the whole thing, that she had not known she was looking for when she stood on a porch 10 years ago and watched a stranger fix her fence. Thomas, at 12 now, was already the kind of person the county would rely on, with his father's patience and his mother's clarity, and a gift for reading whether that neither of them had taught him. He talked about ranching the way Andrew had once talked about fences, with the quiet certainty of someone who has identified the work that is theirs. Clara, at 8, had moved from an authority on chicken characters to an authority on most other things, and was reading everything Frances brought home from town with the appetite of someone who was consuming the world at an ambitious pace. She had already announced she intended to be a teacher, and then revised this to say she intended to teach and also own property, which Frances thought was a thoroughly reasonable ambition, and told her so. The winter of 1892 was mild, and they were grateful for it. Christmas that year was the fullest Frances could remember, with Seth and Adeline and their 2 small children coming over, and a neighbor family from 3 miles west, the Dunlaps, who had become friends over the years, and the house was warm and too loud and smelled of cooking and wood smoke and horses from the outside. And Frances stood in the middle of it all and looked at Andrew across the room where he was talking to Ben Holloway, who was old now but had come out with his wife. And Andrew caught her eye and held it for a moment, and she saw everything in that look, everything they had been and everything they had built, and she smiled at him. He smiled back. The real one, the one that made him young and unguarded, the one she had first seen across her kitchen table with corn bread between them and the whole of everything ahead. She moved through the room toward him, not hurrying, taking her time, stopping to speak to Adeline and to put her hand on Thomas's shoulder where he sat reading in the corner despite everything, and to settle Clara's ongoing argument with the Dunlap children about the correct rules of some game she had invented. By the time she reached Andrew's side, Ben Holloway had been absorbed into another conversation, and Andrew turned to her and she stood beside him the way she had stood beside him through all of it, and he put his hand at the small of her back with the same naturalness as breathing. "Good Christmas," he said. "Very good Christmas," she agreed. "The stove is holding up well. It is a good stove. We have a good life," he said quietly, underneath the noise of the room. She turned and looked at him directly, the way she looked at everything she wanted to see truly. "We have the best life," she said. "The one I did not know I was building until I was halfway into it." He brought her hand up and pressed it to his lips, a gesture that was old-fashioned and completely characteristic, and made her heart do the same thing it had always done, the same warmth, the same certainty. "I did not know what I was looking for," he said, "until I found a fence that needed fixing." "And you could not answer simply why you fixed it," she said. "I still cannot," he said. "Some things are too large for simple answers." She leaned against him in the warm, crowded room, with their children and their friends and the whole built world of their life around them. And she thought that he was right, that some things were too large for simple answers, but that you could live inside the question with great contentment if the person standing beside you was the right one. And she had spent over 9 years confirming, day by ordinary extraordinary day, that Andrew Garrett was precisely, exactly, irrevocably the right one. Outside, the Texas Panhandle went on in every direction under a winter sky that was doing something extraordinary with stars. And the fences held, all of them, the ones he had fixed before she even knew his name, and the ones they had built together since. And the house was warm, and the land was theirs, and the life they had made from an unexpected kindness and an unanswerable question was as solid and as living as the good cedar posts. He had set that first spring morning, when she had walked across the wet grass with her coffee going cold in her hands, and found the rest of her life already at work in her east field, doing what needed doing, the way he always had.